Hello everyone and welcome to today's Connect and Learn webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today or in the future. My name is Rebecca and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Neuro-Linguistic Programming, or NLP, is a powerful communication model that can change the way we interact with our colleagues and clients. This webinar is a part of a series of Connect and Learn webinars designed to support AOD clinicians throughout Victoria. This webinar series is funded by the Victorian Department of Health and hosted by Turning Point. We do like our webinars to be as interactive as possible, so please ask questions via the Q&A function. The questions will be collated and answered by our presenters at the end. Please be aware that our webinars are recorded and are later made available on the Turning Point website. There won't be slides made available, but you can access the recording at any time. We encourage you to stay to the end of the webinar and complete the exit survey when the QR code appears on the final slide, or it will be emailed to you later today. I'd like to introduce our presenter, Ruben Ruolle. Ruben is a qualified social worker, having spent most of his career in the drug and alcohol service provision. Ruben is a certified leadership and life coach and has 16 years leadership experience. Ruben has a particular interest in communication. Welcome, Ruben.
Thanks, Beck. Appreciate that. So welcome everybody to Connect and Learn. As Beck has just done a lovely introduction, thank you. I'll be talking about neuro-linguistic programming. It's pretty strange to be staring at a screen without being able to see everybody's faces, but I hope you find great value in attending today. So thank you for putting the time aside. I'm in Sydney, calling in from Sydney, and there's a huge storm happening. So fingers crossed we stay online with no problem. So I'd just like to also acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we're on today. So please join me in acknowledging the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that's the land I'm on today. They're the traditional custodians on the lands on which we connect with each other today in this Connect and Learn. I respectfully acknowledge any First Nations people at this gathering today. I'd also like to do an acknowledgement of lived and living experience. So I acknowledge those with a lived experience of substance misuse, mental illness, psychological distress and suicidality, and their carers and loved ones. I acknowledge the contribution and the power of people with a lived or living experience in enhancing service efforts. And I acknowledge those that are no longer with us today. So going through the session objectives. So NLP is a huge topic of discussion. We could spend days talking about it, and we've only got a short amount of time. So I'm going to be going through a brief history of NLP and the use of modeling in its development. We're going to explore the Jungian concept of perception is projection. We'll explore this concept through the application of the NLP communication model. We'll develop a beginning understanding of how we receive information from the outside world, how we process it, and how this ultimately influences the way we communicate with others. I'll also explore briefly at the end of the presentation 2 NLP principles, and there are many, that underpin the communication model. And also throughout the presentation, be weaving in some knowledge of how the NLP communication model can be applied to improve our communication with colleagues and our clients. So before we begin, I just wanted to do a disclaimer so that we're really clear about what this session is about. So firstly, it's helpful to talk about what it's not about. So it's not about utilizing neuro-linguistic programming tools, techniques, or strategies with your clients or colleagues. It's not about advocating for NLP tools or techniques to be used with your clients. And it's not about making claims that the application of the NLP model will improve health outcomes for clients. You're probably wondering then, well, why are you presenting? So the reason why I'm presenting is with any model, there can be strong evidence to suggest that good health outcomes are linked to that particular model. In this case, the evidence is quite weak in terms of the actual tools and strategies of NLP being linked to health outcomes. It's quite weak. But as with any model, there's elements of models that can be used to help us to be curious as clinicians, as colleagues, as people in general. And the NLP communication model talks about really how we think. So we hear a lot about what we should be thinking, but we don't hear a lot about how we think. So today I'll be going through that by going through the NLP communication model. So how we think obviously impacts on how we communicate with our colleagues and our clients. So we're talking about the Jungian, Carl Jung. So the Jungian concept of perception is projection. This is a concept which is really well explained using the Neuro-Linguistic Programming communication model to describe its essence. So the NLP communication model emphasizes the importance of understanding that there are an enormous variation in how we all individually interpret, represent events that have occurred and the perspectives that we have of the external world. So I'm really interested in us learning today about how we think rather than what we should be thinking. So you would have heard people say this a lot in your careers. So the golden rule. So the golden rule, you hear people say all the time, I just treat people how I want to be treated. And obviously this has some validity in terms of course, we all want to be treated with respect. We all want to be shown compassion. I think they're universal behaviors and experiences that we all want. And of course, we want to treat other people in that way. But this golden rule presupposes that we should always treat clients and colleagues exactly how they would like to be treated in similar circumstances. The problem with this is that given everyone else has other lived experiences and outlooks that deviate substantively from our own, we stop being a reliable barometer of their needs, values, and goals because we experience things differently. So this helps us to be a bit more curious as clinicians and as colleagues as well. So instead of relying on the golden rule, I'd like us to consider utilizing and applying the platinum rule. Now, the platinum rule talks about us treating people how they want to be treated. So not treating them how we think we would like to be treated in that circumstance, but how they would like to be treated. So this should be a new standard for person-centered care. Now, the platinum rule was popularized by Dr. Tony Alessandra, and he wrote a book of the same name called The Platinum Rule. And it goes this way. So treat others the way they want to be treated. And the platinum rule is a very subtle yet powerful, important shift from false consensus. So it helps us to really be curious about how other people would like to be treated and factor that into how we communicate with others. So adjusting our communication style to better suit that other person we're communicating with. So we do know that communication, effective communication, is a foundational element in developing and maintaining our therapeutic relationships with clients. So there is a lot of evidence to suggest that strong therapeutic relationships are an indicator and a contributor to increases in patient satisfaction and adherence, trust and confidence, improved health outcomes, emotional support and client-centered care, and team collaboration and safety. So before I talk to you about perception is projection and we run through the NLP communication model, just wanted to briefly talk to you about the history of neuro-linguistic programming. So you would never have guessed by these photographs that NLP began in the 70s. I couldn't really find a more modern photograph. But NLP, there were three main founders. There's a third gentleman, Eric Pusilek, but the main noted and reputable NLP founders are John Grinder who is a linguistics professor, and Richard Bandler, who was an undergraduate. So obviously, John Grinder had a strong interest in language and linguistics, how we use the language we use to communicate within our own selves, within our own minds, but also the language we use to communicate with others. And Richard Bandler was a mathematician. So it's an interesting combination of linguistics and mathematics. So they had a really strong interest in observing and modeling three therapists. So they spent approximately 2,000 plus hours observing and modeling three therapists. You may have heard of all three of these therapists. The first one was Fritz Perls, who's the founder of Gestalt therapy, Virginia Satir, who was a renowned family therapist, and Dr. Milton Erickson, who was a hypnotherapist. So why did they want to model? Why did Bandler and Grindler want to model these three therapists? So they discovered that these three people were outstanding as professional agents of change working in the domain of psychotherapy. They also wanted to observe and model them because these three therapists were successful on a consistent basis to enable clients to heal and achieve the outcomes of their sessions. And thirdly, these three therapists could seem to achieve results with their clients that no one else could. So that's a brief history of NLP. From observing and modeling these three therapists, the linguist and the mathematician got together and they decoded some of the strategies and tools that these three therapists were using and tried to put them, I guess, into the NLP model. And there's a tool of trails and techniques and strategies that they use now in the NLP school of thought. But again, because the evidence is quite weak with NLP, I'm just choosing to talk about the NLP communication model today and explain perception is projection by using that model. So Carl Jung is a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. I imagine you've all heard of Carl Jung or Jungian philosophy, psychiatry. So perception is projection. Basically is coined by Carl Jung, and it's about your perception or your interpretation, which is quite simply the meaning you assign to an event, to an experience. So your perception and interpretation in any given situation determines how you feel about things, the way you will act, and the subsequent outcome. So quite simply, perception is projection means what we focus on, we will see. What we project is what is going on inside of us. Now, I don't know who's in this room, and I don't know if anyone remembers the old slide projectors. It was a round carousel where you would put a film in the carousel and you'd shine a light through it and you'd be able to project out. So really our minds are like the slide, and the light shining through what we experience internally is the projection. So science has proven that what we hold in our minds, so our values, our beliefs, our attitudes, determines what we will experience in the external world. Another example of perception is projection. So, when you want a new car, for example, I'd love a gunmetal grey Maserati. So depending on my preference, whether I'm a visual person, kinesthetic, auditory person, that might be my sensory preference. I might go and look at the car, I read about the specs of the car, and I become really focused because that's what I want. And you probably can relate to this. So like if you've wanted a particular car, have you ever noticed that all of a sudden you start seeing it everywhere you go? It's not because there's more cars of that type on the road. It's because you are focused on getting that car. And as a result, that's what you project out and that's what you see in the world. So I want to ask you a question, and I know you can't answer because we're on the webinar, but I'll encourage you to put Q&A, your questions into the Q&A box. Have you ever made assumptions or made meaning about your colleagues or your clients that you later discovered was incorrect? I'd be surprised if there's people in this room who would say that they've never made a wrong assumption about somebody or something. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuro-linguistic programming communication model. So this works on the basis that we'll have an external event. Now that external event could be a critical incident, it could be a conversation with a colleague or a client, it could be anything, could be a car accident, any external event, anything that's operating in the external world outside of yourself. Now, NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, N stands for neuro, and neuro is the sensory information that we take into our neurology. So up until recently, it was thought that we would receive 2 million bits of information coming at us every second. So imagine 2 million bits of information coming at us every second through our sensory perception. So through our eyes, our ears, our feelings, taste, and smell. Most recently, science has shown that it can be up to 12 million bits of information coming at us per second. Can you imagine if we were aware of every single bit of those 12 million bits of information coming at us every second? We would literally lose our minds, or our minds would explode, almost literally. So we need to have a way of making sense of what's happening in our external experience by the information that we take in. So we have two minds. So our subconscious mind and our conscious mind. So our subconscious mind, which is amazing, it keeps us alive. We breathe without thinking, it's automatic. Our heart beats without thinking about it, it's automatic. And our unconscious mind does a lot of filtering as well of our experience, which is also automatic. So part of what I wanted to talk to you about today was it's really important for us at some point in time to make what's happening for us on the unconscious level conscious in order to be able to change our perception of the world. But first, N, as I said, stands for neuro, and this is how we take in our sensory information. So if, for example, our unconscious mind can take in 12 million bits of information per second, I wanted to talk about the conscious mind, so things that we're aware of. We can only take in 134 bits of information per second, which means there's 11,999,866 bits of information that we're not consciously aware of every second. So that means there needs to be a way of us choosing the 134 bits of information that we pay attention to. So we all have different bits of information we focus on. So I want you to think about a critical incident in the workplace, or maybe a car accident that you've witnessed, and you notice there'll be 5 different people who have witnessed the one car accident, and there'll be 5 different interpretations of what occurred. 5 different interpretations or representations of the one event. So this is an example of us all focusing on a different 134 bits of information out of those sensory pieces of information that are coming to us. If you've got questions, please throw them into the Q&A. So you might be asking or thinking about how we then decipher those 134 bits of information. So this is where neuro-linguistic programming model comes into it. So we have meta programs. So our meta programs, and this is in our unconscious mind, but it's believed that our unconscious programming is set from the ages of 0 to 7 years old. So a lot of us are adults getting around in the world, being subconsciously driven by our meta programming or our subconscious programming. So that includes our values, our beliefs, our attitudes, and our memories. So if we're only aware of 134 bits per second, we need to have a way of filtering this information. So our beliefs, our values, and our attitudes are part of the filtering system. that we have unconsciously. We're not even aware of it. So an external event will occur. We have the sensory information coming into our mind, and we subconsciously start to sort that information or filter that information based on our values, beliefs, and attitudes. An example would be, we have a client in front of us. So we may have the belief that the client, and I remember when I was working as a clinician in drug and alcohol, you'd hear people talk about frequent flyers. So people that have been to the service multiple times, and unfortunately we hear people saying things like, oh, so-and-so will be back. And it's understandable that we can feel a little bit apathetic and disillusioned, I guess, when clients are continuously coming back through the doors. But if we're sitting with a client and we have the belief that they're a frequent flyer and nothing is ever going to change, this will obviously impact on how we see the client, what we do and what we don't see. And this will obviously influence how we communicate with the client. So another example could be, there's a staff member who we have the belief or the attitude that they're lazy or that they don't really care like we do. But then one day they do something really amazing and it really surprises us. But because we have the belief that ultimately they're a particular way, we'll have an internal representation of how we think that person is. And that will obviously impact on our communication. So I'm hoping that you're starting to see how an external event and how we filter information in our unconscious and conscious mind impacts on how we see the world and how we communicate. So other filters that also occur in our unconscious mind are generalizing, distorting, and deleting information. So I'll give an example of generalization. So usually this is where one or a few experiences or impressions come to represent a whole class or category of events, objects, or phenomena. For example, a client who has been incarcerated, we may generalize that people who have been incarcerated have a higher likelihood of being aggressive. From this generalization, it may prevent you and this is just one example out of many different things that could occur in this situation if you were generalizing that people who have been incarcerated can be more aggressive. So this generalization may prevent you from asking probing questions that you may be inclined to ask, but instead you decide not to because you have made the decision that they could be aggressive and therefore you don't want to probe too much because that might incite some aggression. And that's just one example, and I'm hoping you're thinking of some examples where you may generalize and how this impacts how you show up with your colleagues and with your clients. I'd be really interested to hear what some generalizations are. If you can put those in the chat, love to discuss those at the end of this. The next filtering system that we have in place to decide what we filter in and what we filter out is distortion. So distortion are irrational ways of reasoning or errors of logic that lead to us making assumptions. So for example, a client might decide to, well, not decide, or they may be behaving in a way where they avoid eye contact with you. Or they may be doing the opposite where they're glaring at you. And from that, you'll have a mental distortion and you'll draw a conclusion of exactly what it means. I know part of this is obviously our clinical reasoning in observing how clients are presenting and their behaviors they're engaging in. But there are many ways we could get wrong by our mental distortions what is actually meant by this behavior. So another example could be with your colleagues, and it's raining really heavily here, so I feel like I'm shouting into the microphone, so hopefully it's not too loud. So distortion is irrational ways of reasoning, errors of logic. So a colleague who's usually really timely in their email responses could take a longer time to reply to you in their email, and perhaps you've had a run-in with them in the office. You could draw the conclusion via the filtering of mental distortion that they must be angry with me. So we start telling our stories, telling ourselves stories. We make meaning based on information that we're paying attention to. And of course, then that would influence how we communicate with that person. So deletion. So deletion is obviously, I often use this example. So you're in a crowded concert, for example, or a crowded public space, and you've lost your friend. You're looking for your friend, you know they're wearing a yellow jumper. So you walk around looking for that friend. And this is an example of deleting out information. You're deleting out everything out of your consciousness that is not yellow, because you're focused on seeing only your friend wearing the yellow jumper. So a deletion in a client example could be that a client who relapses immediately after every inpatient withdrawal admission that they have. So on one occasion out of multiple occasions where they've actually relapsed immediately, they were able to stay abstinent for a period of 5 weeks. But you delete this occasion and state that the client always relapses immediately after the withdrawal admission, and therefore they are not compliant with treatment. So you can see how our filtering can determine our internal representation. So the images, the ideas, and the self-talk, the way we make meaning of an external event, how it comes into our mind, how we filter information, and therefore we end up with an internal representation of what that external event means. And you can see from our own experiences, our own histories, our own education, our own mental health, our own emotional well-being, how all of these factors will determine how we make sense of external events and therefore how we communicate. So in NLP, the L obviously stands for linguistic, but L stands for linguistics, which refers to the internal representations that we have. So I want you to just think about an event that has happened for you recently. It could be at work, could be at home. Just want you can close your eyes, no one's watching, and just remember that event. When you remember that event, do you recall it in an image? Are you saying particular words to yourself about the event? Have you got a narrative going about that event? So often we recall events via mental images. So these also often represent themselves or present themselves in the form of thoughts. For example, if I've generalized that a client in the room is likely to get aggressive, I may have an image in my mind of a previous aggressive client, which is obviously going to impact on my mental and my emotional state. Again, it's really strange presenting when I can't see everybody. I'm used to really interacting and getting a gauge of how the audience is tracking with this information, but hopefully we'll get some time shortly. So our mental and emotional state will occur as a result of all of that processing of information that's coming at us. This obviously then impacts on our physiology. So quite simply, our physiology is our breathing, our facial expressions, and our body language. So I've heard some different figures. Just going to have a sip. I've heard some different figures about communication and the ratio of verbal and non-verbal in our communication. But the latest statistics that I've come across are that our communication consists of 7% words, 38% vocal features, which includes our tone, our tempo, volume, and 55% is attributed to our physiology. So our body language, our breathing. So you imagine you've got a client in the room, they're quite agitated. we have filtered in information and we've filtered out information, and we have an internal representation of what we think that behavior means. That will then have a direct effect and impact on our mental and emotional state and our physiology. So because our unconscious mind is so amazing at taking in all of that information, those millions and millions of bits of information per second, we're actually really, our unconscious mind is really good at picking up non-verbal cues from other people. And the same goes with our colleagues and our clients. So if you as a clinician are in a room and you've got this whole internal representation happening, that is going to impact on your physiology. And therefore, obviously, that's going to impact on your body language, your breathing, especially if you're not aware of it. So again, as I said earlier in this presentation, it's really important for us to become aware of the unconscious drivers of our internal representations and our behavior so that we can be more in control of our mental and emotional state and how we are coming across as clinicians in our sessions with clients, because they're picking up our physiology just as we're picking up theirs. And you may think of a time when you've gone into a situation, could be at work or privately, where something just doesn't feel right and you can't quite put your finger on what it is. But I would dare to say that you've noticed something that you're not consciously aware of that has impacted on you feeling that way. The good news is we can actually attune ourselves to the physiology of clients, given that 55% of our communication is nonverbal. If we're very have good visual acuity and we're observing the clients, we can actually see a whole lot of information. So they may not be saying things. We're looking at their nonverbal communication as well. So this is why it's really important to listen to what's being said and to what is not being said. So this obviously then impacts on our behavior. So the P in NLP stands for programming. So this is how our brain and body reacts to various internal thoughts and external information to produce repetitive behaviors, habits, and thinking. So you could think of an example where, just trying to think of another client example. So a client has come in extremely substance affected. They've come in for an assessment. You've told them that due to consent issues, they're unable to provide informed consent. You don't think it's best that you do an assessment at this point in time because you need to ask a lot of in-depth, quite private questions or sensitive questions, and therefore you'd like to reschedule. The client becomes more agitated. They say, please do the assessment today. You're unable to do it because of what I've just talked about, the consent issues. The person could become withdrawn. They could become aggressive. And by no means am I saying at all that our drug and alcohol clients are aggressive. In fact, I've found quite the opposite most occasions. It's just an example that's coming to mind. We could generalize, distort, and delete information and have an internal representation that will impact our mental state, our emotional state, our physiology, and as a result, our behavior. So we may decide to do the assessment. We may not to just decide to do the assessment based on the information that we are filtering from the external world. Obviously, the behavior we engage in or don't engage in affects the results that we have. So this is a very complex model, but I'm hoping people can take on some of this information and go, yep, that makes sense to me, or ask me some questions when we have our discussion shortly. But before we do that, I want to talk about some of the principles that underpin the NLP communication model. So one of the first principles, there's about 12 different principles. I've only had time to choose a couple today. And the first one is the map is not the territory. So this took me ages to get my head around, but I guess the best way to describe it is the map is not the territory. So you're all in Melbourne, I imagine. There's a map of Melbourne, and then there's the actual Melbourne. So the map is not Melbourne. It's just a representation of the territory. So the map is not the territory is a principle that presupposes that the map, that the meaning we make as clinicians, as partners, as husbands, wives, children's parents, leaders, the meaning we make is not the actual territory. So it's not anyone else's experience or interpretation. It's just our interpretation, not the other person's actual experience. So good communicators realize that the internal representations that they use to organize their experience of the world, the map, are not the world, the territory. So you can see from the NLP communication model that we just went through that we all have so many different variations of how we make meaning of the world. So when we understand that our meaning is not a universal meaning, we can become curious about understanding other people's maps of the world or their interpretations of what they're experiencing. So there can be one event, the territory, but we all have unique experiences of it. So this fundamental principle in practice is about us understanding that what we're thinking about another person, another event, a circumstance is just one way of thinking about it. And there's always another way you could be thinking about it. So remember those 134 bits of information? If we change any one bit of information that we're taking in or that we're filtering, our internal representation or our understanding will be different. This will lead to different behavioral response and different communication. So the second principle that I wanted to run through today was present behavior represents the very best choice available to that person. So, we see a colleague or a client behaving in a particular way that we think isn't appropriate, or they should be behaving differently. And we can be really judgmental. What's wrong with this person? I've told them that they should do A, B, and C, and therefore they'll have a different result, but they just keep doing this same behavior over and over again. And I know previously for myself, both as a clinician and a leader in the drug and alcohol sector, when I would expect people to behave a particular way and become judgmental, I'd be surprised if there's anyone in this room who hasn't had that experience where you become judgmental of someone else's behavior. When I view it from the perspective that this is the very best choice this person has available in that moment, it allows me to approach that person from a completely different perspective. Instead of being judgmental, I can be curious and I can be open to understanding why that person has chosen that behavior, especially understanding that that behavior is the only choice that person feels is available to them in that moment. So this principle presupposes that behind every behavior is a positive intent. I was talking to a group of people the other day about our negativity bias, and that we're wired to seek out cues of danger or to see cues of danger because our survival depends on it. So if I become fearful, i.e. about to log on to a Connect and Learn, feeling nerves, it's because I'm thinking fearful thoughts. It's sparking off my amygdala. My amygdala is releasing stress hormones. It's releasing cortisol, adrenaline, and my amygdala doesn't know whether it's a real threat or a perceived threat. So if I start, skipping over my words or making errors, for example, because I'm fearful, even I could get really annoyed at myself and go, wow, Ruben, like you've let this fear take over you. But when I really think about it and we peel things back, I see that the fear actually has a positive intent. It's there to keep me safe. So if we can view ourselves with compassion and we can view others' behaviors, understanding that behind that behavior, albeit might be a challenging behavior, a difficult behavior to manage, a disappointing behavior, that behind it, this behavior has a positive intent for that person, this will impact how we interact with this person, how we communicate. So again, what I was just saying then was a person makes the best choice available to them at any moment in any given time. And it's based on who the person is. It's based on all their life experiences and the choices that they are aware of. So it's our job as clinicians to put this fundamental principle into practice. So you may have heard of it in therapeutic circles where we talk about holding people in the highest regard. I guess it falls into a similar school of thought, which is to, really see that the person is doing the best they can with the resources that they have at their disposal. So this fundamental principle in practice is that in order for a person to change their behavior, it is necessary to give them other choices and for them to understand that there are other options available. So you can see how if we approach our interactions with our clients and our colleagues with map is not the territory, and that a person's present behavior represents the very best choice available to them, it changes our own internal representation, and therefore it changes how we feel, our mental and emotional state, and how we make sense of the situation, and therefore how we communicate. So the benefits of the NLP communication model, and again, some of these trainings go over days and days. I am a master practitioner in Neuro-Linguistic Programming and hypnotherapy, and that's 40 days training in total. So a very in-depth model, difficult to summarize in a short period of time, but there are many benefits, and I think I've touched on some of these as we've gone through the presentation. So the first benefit is that if we understand that we all make different meaning, this changes how we approach our communication. And to approach our communication, understanding that we all make different meaning, means that we are more likely to adopt an attitude of curiosity, seeking to understand others' preferences and perspectives, and perhaps why they understand things in a particular way, and perhaps why they communicate in a particular way. And going back to the platinum rule, if we tailor our communication and treat people how they want to be treated, it's amazing how much more improved our communication can be. I don't know if you've ever been, so I'm a visual person, so my visual kinesthetic. So I will talk a lot about I see the big picture, the balcony view. I need to have a look at the details. You'll hear in my language, I talk a lot about seeing the big picture and images. So if you attune to a client, for example, and you hear them, oh, see, there I go again. You hear them talking about, oh, I need to listen to that again. Can you say that again? I need to hear different perspectives. They'll give you clues in their communication style, which could be their preference, which is auditory, so hearing information. If you attune your communication style to that person, you'll be amazed at how quickly you go into rapport with that person. And obviously, rapport, therapeutic relationships, we have better communication, more effective client outcomes. So again, the NLP communication model requires us to actively adapt strategies such as active listening, using clear and concise language, and being aware of nonverbal cues, given they constitute 55% of our communication. And the benefits of the NLP communication model is it enables us to develop enhanced rapport by aligning our communication style, as I just went through with you, with that of the other person. So treating others how they want to be treated. And we don't have time to go into this today, but I just wanted to put down the bottom here, mirroring and matching non-verbal behavior. And I don't mean, I'm thinking about one client I'd met him for the first time, and within 5 minutes, we were standing in exactly the same position. And that wasn't something we both consciously did, but I became consciously aware that we were in strong rapport with each other. So you can mirror clients. If somebody's got their arms folded, you can fold your arms as well. Doesn't mean you're closed off. It just means you're matching that person's behavior or mirroring. And you can slowly move. You might put your hand to your face. If that client moves their hand as well, they move out of that. They're starting to get into rapport with you. So obviously, mirroring behavior increases rapport, creates trusts, and develops understanding. I don't know if you guys heard that huge crack of lightning that just happened, but it's perfect timing because that is all I have in this presentation. So I'm really keen to listen to people's questions. Hopefully I can answer them, but I truly hope you got something out of the session today that you can take back into your work with clients and your relationships with your colleagues.
Thank you so much, Ruben. And thank you everyone for your questions. Ruben, are you ready for them?
I am.
Okay. Could generalize be the same as stereotyping?
Great question. Yes, I believe so. So, yeah, we have one experience of a particular person. It could be, gender stereotyping or racial stereotyping, but generalization, yes, it's applying a general consensus about a particular group or a particular event based on usually one or two experiences. So, yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruben. So you asked for examples of how people might generalize, and I've just got one here, which I thought we'd share one.
Sure.
Making generalizations about mandated clients and assumptions about others who are otherwise, coerced into AOD services, maybe by a family or their partner. I am often pleasantly surprised by them engaging beyond mandated treatment and making the most of the time they have to spend at services.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's awesome to hear as well. And that's why I made it really clear as well as just using a generalization, because that's certainly been my experience as well. But I wonder if the person who generously put that in the chat, if the outcome or the projection they're seeing from the client in terms of actually being really engaged in treatment is a result of the perception of the particular clinician in the room. So I'm wondering if there's something specifically that the clinician is doing that is allowing the client to show up in that way. And I wonder if somebody went into a session as a clinician and had a different perception that they weren't going to engage, if that actually impacts on what they project as a clinician and therefore the communication they have. So the questions they ask, the questions they don't ask. Because you think about, if you think somebody's not going to engage because they're there in a mandatory sense, I wonder if that would impact what questions you ask, your body language, the level of interest you demonstrate, the options you provide. So you can see how what's going on inside of us has a direct correlation to what we bring to the session, what we bring to the communication, and dare say the impacts or the outcomes that our clients achieve. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ruben. So someone's written loving this with lots of exclamation marks.
Great. Thank you.
Do you have a recommendation for an introductory text or manual for complete novices? I've got a great book at home, but it's so detailed I can't see the wood for the trees.
Okay. There are lots of recommendations, and luckily I've got one here, something I prepared earlier. So this is the essential guide of NLP. I relate, I empathize, I sympathize. Reading about this stuff can be quite a headache. So I appreciate you all being very patient while I try to relay some information to you today. But this is the essential guide to neuro-linguistic programming by Tom Hubiar and Tom Dotz. But Beck, I'm absolutely happy for people to email you and you to pass it on to me, and I can write some recommendations in an email as well, because this one can still be a bit heavy.
That's wonderful, Ruben. Thank you.
No worries.
And maybe we can send out a one-pager
Mm-hmm.
when we thank attendees for attending
Mm,
with some resources.
mm-hmm.
From the same person, they would love to know if you have any other training recommendations.
I know it's so hard not being able to just have a conversation. Um, Training recommendations. So I did my training through the Life Coaching College. But there are some short courses, and I do have some recommendations of the most important NLP principles. The biggest benefit that NLP's had for me, and I'm aware of I guess the debate that can happen about the usefulness of NLP. And there's some things that are really complicated, but like I said at the beginning, there's some elements of this model that are just amazing, that have changed the way I see the world.
Mhm.
And how yeah, so I've got some recommendations. Again, I might put some in a one pager,
Yeah.
so everyone has access to them that have attended today or watched the recording. Yeah,
Thanks, Ruben. And look, I know you're a busy person, but is that, is further training something you can offer? There's,
absolutely.
yeah, enough
Yeah.
people.
So training with groups of people. I also use NLP, some of the tools, especially the communication model, around our beliefs and our values, and how if we change those, it impacts how we our internal representations. So we do some of that work in coaching. I interweave it in my training with organizations as well. So yeah, absolutely happy to have a conversation with anyone who might be interested in knowing about this and a whole lot more. So it's just one part of what I do.
Amazing. Thank you. How does NLP work when there are issues such as family violence, bullying,
Mm,
issues created by external environment or external people?
mm.
Uh, sorry, yeah. How
No,
does
that's
it work?
okay. That's a big question. Great question. Thank you. And I was actually reflecting on this morning, because I was thinking about the sorts of questions that might come through. So obviously there's always external events. We're not arguing that they don't exist. And obviously domestic family violence is a terrible, horrible external event that obviously has far-reaching consequences for a lot of people. Um, I'm not sure if the question is about how we would use NLP as a clinician
Yeah,
in
sorry,
our
Ruben.
understanding
I
of.
just noticed it's a two-parter.
That's
Um,
okay. Cool.
is it practical or fair to view people without their environment?
These are great questions. I think we've got another couple of hours we could talk about this. Um, is it? Can you ask that question again?
Yeah, hang on, I just don't know where I put it. Hang on.
I don't know the exact word. Is it
Um, Hang on.
fair?
Okay, I'm gonna do it all again.
Sorry, Beck.
No, 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 my fault. How does NLP work when there are
Hmm.
issues such as family violence or
Hmm.
bullying? Issues created by external environment or external people.
Mm.
Is it practical or fair to view people without their environment?
I think understanding people's environment is really important in understanding, I guess, some of the drivers behind perhaps why they present in particular ways. Um, this communication model can be adapted not only as clinicians to understand how we are interpreting what's happening, But what I would be wanting to do as a clinician is be really curious about how the person who's experienced the family violence, how they are interpreting that. What does it mean about them? I mean, you probably hear a lot of people say, there must be something wrong with me, otherwise they wouldn't treat me like this. So us becoming really curious about how the person views what's happening to them, how they represent that to themselves, and how that impacts on how they show up in the world. But us as clinicians being really curious about understanding the person, not only who we see in the room and the communication that we're experiencing in the room, but also listening to them about their experience and how they understand their environment and how that either benefits or impacts them negatively. I hope that answered the question. That's a big juicy one, because there's so many different angles we could come at that from. But I think it is at the base of it, it's understanding how other people make sense of their environment. Because you might, as a clinician, think you need to get out of that environment. It's shocking, but their understanding or the representation of what that means may be completely different. So our job is to be really curious and understand what it means for that person. And if the meaning they're making isn't serving them, can we support them to make different meaning for a different outcome?
Thank you, Ruben. I'm just going to say in advance to people that we don't have time to answer all of your questions. But thank you so much for putting them through. And Ruben, we'll try and power through a few if we can.
Yeah, go for it.
So next one is, while hearing all the perceptions and behaviour, I see that CBT and NLP share some similarities. Could you illustrate how NLP intervenes differently from CBT in your work?
Well, great question again. I use lots of different models in my work. As I said at the beginning, some models have, benefits and limitations. Most do. I think with CBT, it's obviously a lot about the thought, the feeling, or the emotion and the feeling, and then the behavior. With NLP, it follows a similar, the NLP communication model follows a similar course, which is obviously you have an external event, you take in a whole lot of information, you have a representation that impacts your emotions and that impacts your behaviors. I guess CBT cognitively delves into, I guess, really the thinking. What are the sorts of thoughts we're having that are not serving us anymore? I think the NLP communication model in my work, I go another level, which is, okay, we can change your thoughts, but if your unconscious beliefs, values, attitudes that you're not even necessarily consciously aware of are driving that thinking, we can adjust the thinking on the surface, but until we get down another layer and we start addressing some of the limiting beliefs, like one of my limiting beliefs, full disclosure, was I'm not good enough. So that manifested in a whole range of ways, being an overachiever, a state athlete, a straight A student, because, hey, if I'm not good enough, if I do all these things and I achieve, God, I must be good enough, and I can change my thinking and go, I am good enough. But unless I change the belief and get deep on that, where it comes from, why I have that, and changing that belief, the changing of the thought will be quite surface level for me, and that's been my experience. So again, it depends on the person in the session or the group that I'm running. But yeah, we can use lots of different techniques. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Sorry, I've just got so many. I'm trying to see if we've got some.
That's good.
Here. Are the benefits of NLP similar to identifying the person's stage of change and working with them where they are at rather than where you want them to be at?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you know what I love is what the questions people are asking. My perception is that people are really thinking about, oh, how is this similar or different to what we're already doing, and how perhaps can this add value? I think you always want to work with where the person's at. But I think part of our role as clinicians is to give people other options. Like that last principle I talked about in terms of the behavior is the very best choice available to a person, is it's our job to perhaps suggest and or help people to believe that there's other options available to them. So there's stages of change. If they're pre-contemplative, well, tell me about that. What does that mean for you? Like if you're not ready to change, tell me about what that means for you. Yeah, and understand how they represent what's happening in their life. But yeah, there are lots of parallels or concurrencies between different models. So I imagine the stages of change, we'd be working with people where they're at by introducing other options or information to allow them to make informed choices about what's right for them next.
Thank you, Ruben. Look, we've just had incredible interest, and I know that we're over time now, but I'm going to ask you one more question because people are really interested.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Can I please ask, where did you do your 40 days of your master in NLP and hypnosis from? Would love to explore more as I have a keen interest in this area.
I would encourage that person to get in contact with me after the if you look me up, you'll see me on LinkedIn, you'll see me, if you just look at my name, you'll see my website as well, and just get in contact. Yeah, because it depends on what you're after. Yeah. But I trained with the Life Coaching College.
Thank you. And apologies, everyone, that we didn't get through all the questions, but thank you for your interest. And thank you, Ruben, for being so generous with your time and
Thank you.
so generous in advance with your time by, allowing people to contact you. Thanks, everyone. Ruben, do we have a slide where people
yes, we do.
feedback?
Thank you. So that's my business name, Other Side Edge. And here is your feedback QR code.
Thank you. And we really appreciate if people can fill that out. Thanks again, Ruben. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.